There was a time when money had a heartbeat and it pulsed from London. The clatter of coins, the whispers in smoke-filled banks, the distant echoes of ships loading gold and goods, all of it moved to the rhythm of one name, the British pound. To hold it was to hold a promise backed by the might of an empire that stretched across the world. From India to Africa, from the Caribbean to Hong Kong, the pound was more than currency. It was control. It was confidence. It was the sun never setting, not on land, but on value itself. Victorian London wasn't just a city. It was the planet's financial nerve center. Within its narrow streets, men in top hats decided the fate of nations with pens instead of swords. The gold standard made every pound a piece of something real metal, mined and measured. It gave money weight. It made trust visible. The world believed in gold, and gold believed in Britain. Ships left the Thames carrying textiles and tea, but they also carried the system that bound the world together, contracts, credit, and the idea that sterling was stability. Foreign merchants, even enemies, accepted it without hesitation. It was the language of empire, spoken in silver and sealed in gold. But beneath the glitter of wealth was a quiet arrogance, a belief that the empire's grip on money was eternal. No one imagined a time when London would fade from the center of the map, or when another currency would dare to take its throne. Yet history has a cruel rhythm of its own. Every empire, like every fortune, eventually finds its limit. And the pound, once untouchable, soon began to tremble under the weight of its own greatness. Empires rarely notice when their golden age begins to end. The change doesn't arrive with thunder, it comes quietly, like cracks forming beneath polished marble. For Britain, the first cracks appeared not in battlefields, but in factories. Across the Atlantic, the United States was roaring to life. In Germany, steel and science were rising like a tide. Britain, once the workshop of the world, was slowly being outproduced by nations that had learned from its success and were improving upon it. The empire still dressed itself in pride. London remained elegant, its bankers confident, its parliament certain that the pound's power was eternal. But numbers don't lie. The trade surpluses that once fueled the empire were shrinking. Industrial power was shifting westward, and the pound, that symbol of stability, was quietly becoming overvalued. It looked strong, but it wasn't. Like a king wearing borrowed jewels, its shine was more illusion than substance. Then came the Great War, the event that shattered illusions everywhere. For 4 years, Britain poured its gold, its men, and its future into the trenches of Europe. Cannons thundered, but so did printing presses. The gold standard, once sacred, was abandoned as the nation borrowed and spent to survive. The world's banker had become its biggest debtor. For the first time, the pound's strength depended not on gold, but on faith. Faith that the empire would endure. When the war finally ended, victory felt hollow. The treasury was drained, the colonies restless, and the factories tired. Yet the illusion of control continued. Britain tried desperately to restore the gold standard, to pretend the old world still existed. But each attempt made things worse. Restoring the pound's pre-war value meant punishing the economy with austerity and unemployment. Pride demanded it. Reality disagreed. Meanwhile, in New York, the future was being built. The dollar was gaining quiet respect, not through conquest, but through production and lending. As Britain borrowed, America lent. As Britain imported, America exported. Slowly, invisibly, power was shifting across the ocean. Inside the halls of Westminster, the old guard refused to see it. They still believed the empire ruled the waves, that London was the center of finance, that history would bend to tradition. But the truth was simpler and crueler. The empire that had once financed the world could no longer finance itself. The cracks in the crown were widening. The pound still glittered, still commanded respect, but its foundation was eroding grain by grain. The gold standard that had once anchored the empire was gone, replaced by promises and paper. Debt had replaced discipline. In the cafes and trading rooms of London, few wanted to admit what was happening. Empires rarely die with honesty. They die with ceremony and denial. And so Britain carried on, draped in nostalgia, unaware that the torch of global power had already begun to pass, quietly to a younger empire across the sea. Across the Atlantic, a new rhythm was rising. While Europe burned and borrowed, America built and banked. Its factories roared day and night, turning steel, oil, and grain into gold. Ships once filled with British goods now carried American ones, and the world's money, desperate for safety, began to flow toward New York. The same gold that once filled London's vaults was crossing the ocean, quietly crowning a new financial empire. By the end of the First World War, the United States wasn't just a participant, it was the world's creditor. Nations owed America everything: weapons, food, loans, and hope. The dollar, once an upstart currency, began to mirror the pound's old strength. It was backed not just by metal, but by production real, relentless industry that made faith easy to believe in. The world's banks started keeping their reserves in dollars. Wall Street began to hum with the confidence of a city discovering its destiny. In Washington and New York, a silent revolution was taking shape. American policymakers watched Britain's struggles and took notes. They saw how power was not just about armies or colonies, but about who owned the debt. They built institutions, strengthened their banks, and tied foreign trade to the dollar. The United States was no longer a debtor nation, it was the world's lender, the beating heart of post-war finance. As Europe tried to rebuild, it looked westward for rescue and found it waiting, open-handed but calculating. The dollar had become the new language of global trust, spoken in every trade, whispered in every loan. America didn't need to conquer the old empires, it simply outgrew them. The century that followed would belong not to kings or colonies, but to the currency of the new world, green, powerful, and unstoppable. The Second World War was still burning when the victors began planning the peace. In a quiet mountain town called Bretton Woods, delegates from 44 nations gathered to design a new global order. But behind the talk of unity and recovery, something far greater was happening, a silent transfer of power. Britain arrived exhausted, its empire battered and bankrupt. America arrived wealthy, confident, and holding most of the world's gold. The outcome was already written. In the Grand Hall of the Mount Washington Hotel, American officials outlined a plan that would reshape money itself. The world needed stability, they said. It needed trust. And that trust, from now on, would be measured in dollars. The system they proposed was simple, at least on paper. The U.S. dollar would be tied to gold at a fixed rate. Every other currency would be tied to the dollar. Nations could trade and rebuild, knowing their money was anchored to something solid. But beneath that promise was a quiet truth. Control of the world's gold meant control of the world's money. For Britain, it was humiliating. Once the financial heart of the planet, it now signed an agreement that placed it in the shadow of its former colony. The pound, once the standard of value, became a follower. London's bankers watched as Wall Street took their place. Yet, there was no war, no surrender, just signatures and smiles. A quiet coup written in ink, not blood. When the conference ended, the new era had begun. The American flag now flew over the global financial system. The world would trade not in British confidence, but in American faith. The throne had changed hands, and most of the world didn't even realize it had happened. By the 1950s, Britain was pretending nothing had changed. The pound still looked proud on paper, and politicians still spoke as if London ruled the financial world. But behind the speeches was panic. The empire had shrunk, Debts had grown, and the world now traded in dollars, not sterling. Britain's reserves were leaking away like sand through open fingers. Every attempt to defend the pound cost more than the last. The government borrowed endlessly to keep up the illusion of strength. Banks intervened, interest rates rose, and quiet deals were made with Washington. But the truth was inescapable. The pound was living on borrowed time. The U.S., now the world's banker, occasionally stepped in to help, not out of friendship, but to keep the global system stable. It was charity disguised as cooperation. In 1967, the facade finally cracked. After months of secret talks with the International Monetary Fund, Britain admitted what everyone already knew. The pound was overvalued. The government devalued it overnight, cutting its worth by more than 10%. For a country that once defined financial discipline, it was a moment of national humiliation. The newspapers called it a disaster. Ordinary people saw their savings shrink. The world saw the last symbol of British dominance crumble. The devaluation wasn't just an economic event, it was the final surrender of pride. Britain could no longer pretend to stand equal with America. The pound had gone from the standard of global trade to a struggling national currency propped up by loans and promises. The crown of finance had slipped beyond reach. From that day on, the world looked not to London for leadership, but to Washington. The empire's money had fallen, and with it, the illusion of power that had lasted for a century. By the early 1970s, the world was built on a promise that every U.S. dollar could be exchanged for gold. It was the foundation of the post-war order, the belief that kept global trade balanced and trust intact. But promises, like empires, are easy to make and hard to keep. As America spent billions on the Vietnam War and its growing consumer boom, gold reserves began to drain. Too many dollars, not enough gold. Other nations saw it coming and started demanding metal instead of paper. The vaults of Fort Knox began to empty and confidence started to crack. Then, in August 1971, President Richard Nixon went on television and quietly changed the world. With a calm voice and firm smile, he announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars into gold. In a single stroke, the link between money and metal, between value and something real, was broken. Economists called it the Nixon shock. To many, it was the end of the financial world they knew. But something strange happened. The dollar didn't collapse. It became stronger. Freed from gold, it was now backed by something even more powerful, America itself. Its military, its markets, its oil deals, and its global influence replaced the need for metal. Trust no longer came from gold bars in a vault, but from the belief that the U.S. could enforce its will anywhere on Earth. The pound had once ruled through trade, but the dollar ruled through systems, oil, finance, and force. The age of metal money was over. The age of paper empires had begun. And while the world had lost gold, it had gained something far more dangerous, a currency backed not by purity, but by power. After the gold link was broken, the world expected chaos. But America had already planned its next move. If money could no longer be tied to metal, it would be tied to something everyone needed: oil. In the early 1970s, U.S. officials struck a deal with Saudi Arabia and other major oil producers. Sell your oil only in dollars, and in return, America would offer protection, weapons, and political power. It was a quiet arrangement, but it changed everything. From that moment, the dollar became the ticket to energy, the one resource every nation needed to survive. Countries that wanted oil had to first get dollars. And to get dollars, they had to trade with or borrow from the United States. This system, later called the petrodollar, turned global demand for energy into global demand for American currency. It gave the U.S. an invisible advantage, the power to print what others had to earn. As oil tankers crossed the seas, Every barrel reinforced the dollar's throne. Nations stocked their reserves with it, banks traded it, and markets worshipped it. The pound, once the pride of the British Empire, faded into regional importance, respected but no longer relevant. London still talked finance, but Washington pulled the strings. The world that had once bowed to Britain now moved in sync with America's economy. Wars, recessions, and crises came and went, but the dollar endured. Not because it was perfect, but because everyone needed it. It had become oxygen unseen but essential. The empire of gold had been replaced by an empire of paper, built not on metal or morality, but on momentum. And as long as oil flowed and faith held, the dollar's rule would remain unchallenged. Every empire believes its power will last forever. Britain once thought so. America thinks so now. But history moves in cycles, not in mercy. The story of the pound is not just about currency, but about confidence, about how nations rise on belief and fall when that belief breaks. The pound didn't die because it lost value on paper. It died because the world stopped trusting what it represented. When trust fades, numbers mean nothing. That's the real lesson. Britain learned it slowly, through decades of denial, debt, and pride. The same pattern now shadows the United States. The dollar still reigns strong, loud, and everywhere but behind the strength lies the same fragility that once haunted the pound. Endless borrowing, political chaos, and the illusion that power alone can hold value forever. One day, the world may look at America the way it once looked at Britain, as a giant tired from carrying its own weight. The shift won't come with explosions or treaties, but with quiet choices. Nations will trade in new currencies, digital systems will rise, and trust will migrate, as it always does, to wherever stability feels real. The next global standard may not be born in gold or paper, but in code. The pound's fall wasn't an ending. It was a mirror, a reflection of what happens when belief outgrows reality. And the current trajectory of the dollar is headed to follow the pound in its fall, as it has for so long in its might, not through defeat, but through exhaustion. Power fades not when it's taken, but when it's no longer deserved. The torch Britain passed to America will be passed again, not in war, but in silence. Because the empire that rules tomorrow won't be crowned in gold. It will be crowned in trust.